In my program today, I will again be focusing heavily on the increasingly dramatic and important events on Ukrainian battlefields. But before I turn to that topic, I want to say something about events in the United States yesterday. Now, those who follow my programs on this channel, and who've also followed us on the Duran, will know that I'm as someone who is a grizzled veteran of many bureaucratic plots. I have a good nose for smelling out when plots are taking place. And a plot was on full and public display in the United States yesterday. If one was following the news over the course of the day, one would have read and heard article after article, commentary after commentary, published in every media outlet that one could find, that the President, Joe Biden, had come grudgingly to the conclusion that he was no longer in a position to continue his campaign, and that he was preparing to quit the election, and that there would be an announcement to that effect from the president either today or tomorrow or perhaps on Sunday. To the best of my knowledge, the claims were first kicked off by an article in Axios, but they very soon proliferated in other places, and before long they reached the British media, and there was a long article to this effect in the Financial Times yesterday, which I've noticed, well, you can still find it, but it's now been taken off the main part of the opinion pages. The reality is that the president is still there. No announcement has been made so far, and all of the frantic talk that the president was about to step down, or at least step down from his position as candidate, has, as of today, abated. What I suspect happened is that, yet again, following the display of confident unity at the Republican convention, and with a probably information coming in from private opinion polls showing a lengthening lead for Donald Trump in the election, and critically, signs that certain Democratic Party candidates, in particular congressional districts, were running into more and more problems. A decision was made by the leaders of the Democratic Party that they would try to bulldoze the president into agreeing to their increasingly urgent demand that he stand down. And the extent to which all of these various participants in this event, who I suspect, in fact, I'm sure, include former President Obama, Senate leader Chuck Schumer, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Adam Schiff, various donors, all of these people seem to have been working over the course of yesterday, arranging through their various proxies to keep the media briefed and spreading stories that the president had already, in fact, agreed to step down. I don't think that the president had actually agreed any such thing, and it seems that one particular part of the narrative that was being spread yesterday, which is that the historian John Meacham, who is known to have contributed to several of the president's speeches, was in the process of drafting a speech for the president in which he would announce his decision to stand down from the nomination. Anyway, that story, it seems, is definitely untrue. Apparently, Meacham has denied it in various messages that he has sent out to various people. So I'm not sure that the president himself was spoken to or even consulted over the course of yesterday, but clearly the pressure on him is building and no doubt will continue to build, and we will see what does eventually happen. Now, one aspect of this story I found absolutely astonishing, and I don't really understand, but there are reports that the donors, who also want the president to stand down, have apparently signalled that the money that they have donated is now frozen and cannot be used by the president's campaign. I did not know that this could be done. I'd always assumed that if somebody donated money, and what else does a donor do, then the money from that moment on belongs to the person or persons to whom it has been donated, or if you prefer, gifted. In other words, that there has been what the lawyers call a transfer of ownership or title. It seems not. It seems that somehow or other, the donors still have some ability to control the distribution of their money, of the money which they have supposedly donated. It seems, in fact, as if the money is not actually donated at all, just made available to be used by the candidate in order to win and fight to finance and win his election. Now, if that is how things like this are done in the United States today, then that further explains the incredible power of the donor class. It means that they can control candidates because they can turn on and off, turn the money spigot on and off whenever they choose, whatever, in response to whatever happens or to whatever the candidate actually does. Their power over the candidate, in other words, is enormous and is continuous throughout the election. Well, anyway, we will see what happens. My own guess is that the plot, because a plot is what it is going to succeed. I think the president's advisors, if not the president himself, probably will come to understand at some point over the next few days that it is simply not an option for the president to go on campaigning, acting as if he is the nominee, when it is clear that most of the Democratic Party, or at least its leaders, do not want him. And at some point, I think the penny will finally drop, and the president will understand that he has no realistic option other than to announce that he is ending his campaign. However, there are reports which also say that the president has made it clear that if this does indeed happen, that he will not stand down from the presidency, and that he will not endorse whoever the Democratic Party chooses to replace him as its candidate, and specifically that he will not endorse Kamala Harris. If that stance is maintained, then the Democratic Party's problems, it seems to me, are going to grow, because they will have in the White House an incumbent who is the former leader of their party and who they combined to have elected, and who will be exposed as an angry old man, bitter and angry towards his own party for refusing to support him in this election. And how that is going to play out with the American voters, I don't even want to try and guess or predict. As I said, it seems to me that this is a terrible mess, and it is becoming an ever greater mess still. I just wanted to finish this by saying that I understand that to the extent that the president has any supporters left, they tend to come principally from the Congressional Black Caucus. The president has always had a strong relationship with many of the figures within that caucus. I suspect that one of the reasons that they're clinging on to him is because they see him as a route to maintain their own influence within the Democratic Party. And in addition, the fact that there are signs, growing signs, that support from their community is slipping away and is transferring to Donald Trump. Well, I suspect that in the way that often happens, that will probably mean that the members of the Congressional Black Caucus, their instinct will be to cling to the president even more firmly. Anyway, we'll see what happens. Sunday is the day when we're told the announcement is going to be made. We will see whether there is indeed such an announcement, and we will see how things play out from that moment. Anyway, even as there is chaos and disorganization and furious plotting within the Democratic Party, the Republican Party has come together and united behind Donald Trump and his choice as Vice President, J.D. Vance. And yesterday, it was Donald Trump's turn to give his speech to the convention. And it went on for 90 minutes. And, well, there are different views about the speech. If you read the New York Times, it was perhaps the worst speech ever delivered by a presidential candidate to the nominating convention. That is hyperbole. We can discount it. But I will make my own quick take my own quick view. I think the president said, Donald Trump said a few days ago that he'd scrapped the original speech that he'd intended to deliver to the convention following the assassination attempt that had been made upon him. And that in light of that assassination attempt, he was going to have his speech completely redrafted. Well, I think that the speech he delivered yesterday shows all the signs of hurried redrafting. In fact, it looked to me like two speeches tacked onto each other. The first draft, the original speech that he was intended to make, which is what he basically said in the second part of his address yesterday, the usual boilerplate language, the attacks on his opponents, the jokes, all that kind of thing, delivered without a huge amount of conviction this time, in a somewhat flat voice. And the new part of the speech, the part that dealt with the assassination, about which Donald Trump seemed an awful lot more interested, and which he delivered with a great deal more conviction and energy. I think this is entirely unsurprising that when one has a situation where a previous speech has been canned and a new speech has been cobbled together at great speed, that you get this rather clunky product and accompanied by this somewhat clunky delivery. But I think, for what it's worth, the first part of the speech, which was the part that ultimately mattered, did what it needed to do. And I think that Trump and his vice president, his new vice presidential nominee, J.D. Vance, have come out of this convention strengthened, and the convention overall must be considered a resounding success for them. Now, none of this, of course, definitely means that the election in November is in the bag. The opinion polls still seem to be very tight, but of course these are only the publicly published opinion polls. I suspect that there's an awful lot more private polling going on, which may give a somewhat different story. And it does seem as if Trump is now ahead of Biden in all the key battleground states, and that the gap between him and Biden is in fact steadily growing. So it's not in the bag. And of course, if the Democrats, through some strange alchemical process, are able to come up with a convincing and powerful candidate, well, it could be that there will be a major electoral upset in the election, and it could also be that all the various techniques and methods that have been used in previous elections will be used again and will weigh against Donald Trump and will weigh in favor of whoever it is the Democrats select. So it's clear that the election is not in the bag, but the odds must now strongly be that in November, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance will be elected President and Vice President of the United States, paving the way for their inauguration in January of next year. Of course, if we get what must be for the Democrats the absolute disaster scenario, one in which Biden stands down as candidate but insists on remaining president and drags out his presidency till January, well, the odds on a Trump presidency will shorten still. That is my own view. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this event, the events that took place in the United States yesterday. To repeat again, I am sure that what we saw yesterday was a plot. Decisions were announced as having been made, which I don't think had in fact yet been made. But more likely than not, the plot will succeed and the president will indeed announce that he's stepping down as a candidate on Sunday. In fact, it's a reasonable guess that what is now taking place is not so much the president and his entourage still resisting demands that he step down, but rather a complex negotiation between the president and the other leaders of the Democratic Party, whereby the terms of his retirement are negotiated and agreed so that he leaves the field as the candidate with some dignity and some honor. Anyway, we'll see what happens. Let's turn to the situation in Ukraine. In my program yesterday, I spoke about the fact that the Russians appear to have achieved 3 major breakthroughs in 3 different places over the course of the previous 24 hours. In the south, in the area around the town of Vuhledar, the Russians have broken through and have occupied a section of the road that runs from Konstantinovka to Vuhledar. And in further north, in Chasiv Yar, the Russians have broken through into the central areas of Chasiv Yar. There is now fighting going on deep inside this town. this key strategic town. The Russians have advanced further and faster inside Chasiv Yar than anybody had anticipated. And lastly, there were lots and lots of rumours and speculations, difficult to discuss in detail because of a dearth of information, but lots of rumours and reports that the Russians had crossed the border in force in Sumy region, occupied for a time at least certain border villages, in fact also some villages that are not that close to the border, advanced north of the main road that leads to Kiev itself, and that this had caused shock and a degree of panic in Kiev itself. We've had no further reports as of today about the true situation in Sumy region. The Russians remain tight-lipped about what's going on there. The Ukrainians obviously don't want to talk about the situation in Sumy region very much themselves either. The exact nature of what is going on is unclear. As I discussed yesterday, it could be that all that happened yesterday, or that was reported yesterday, was basically a large-scale raid by the Russian forces, that they crossed the border, briefly occupied some villages, got a sense of what the Ukrainian defences in the area were like, and then immediately pulled back. Or it could be that something a lot more serious took place and is taking place, which we do not yet know fully about. The latter possibility cannot be discounted at all. We saw that this is exactly what happened with the start of the Kharkiv operation and the Toretsk operation, both of which began over the last couple of weeks. In both cases, initial reports of a major Russian incursion seemed confusing and unconvincing and led many people, myself included, to think that some kind of raid was underway, until it turned out that it wasn't, and that this was an actual serious offensive. And beyond that, we've also seen, we see it again in Chasiv Yar, that the fact that for long stretches we are not getting news from a particular part of the battlefronts does not mean that important events are not taking place. In the case of Chasiv Yar, it is clear that heavy fighting has been going on for many, many days, that the Russian advance into central Chasiv Yar has been underway for some time. The fact that we didn't know about it is simply because both the Russians and the Ukrainians, for separate reasons, took a decision not to talk about it. Anyway, I'm not going to say more about the events in Sumy region because obviously I don't really know what is actually going on there. But in the other two places, near Vuhledar and in Chasiv Yar, the situation is, I think, reasonably clear, and the fighting continues in those places today along the same trend lines that I discussed yesterday. Now, I'm going to speak first about Chasiv Yar because here we have significantly less news. As I said, the Russians are clearly positioned now in central Chasiv Yar, and it's also clear that the Russians have now fully occupied the village of Kalinina, northeast of Chasiv Yar, east of the aqueduct, and that they are pushing northward also in this area, which is still east of the aqueduct, towards the village of Grigorievka, which, by the way, I understand is in low ground relative to the territory the Russians already control. and therefore likely to be captured by the Russians fairly quickly. Now, in my program yesterday, I said that what the Russians seemed to be doing was widening their flanks, the area that they control on the northern flank of Chasiv Yar, so as to position themselves more effectively in order to cross the aqueduct and to attack Chasiv Yar from the north. And I also speculated, and by the way, still believe, that the advance on central Chasiv Yar has actually taken place, both from the north, from the northern flanks, in other words, that the Russian troops have crossed the aqueduct north of Chasiv Yar and attacked Chasiv Yar from the north, as well as from the east, along the main road, from the micro district which the Russians now control east of the aqueduct, the road that leads from the micro district directly into the center of Chasiv Yar. I suspect that the Russians have been advancing through that territory already. Anyway, that's my understanding of what is actually happening here. But Dima at the Military Summary channel did make a rather interesting point, which is that he said that if the Russians capture this village of Grigorivka, north of Kalinina, and then continue to push northwards from Grigorivka and move forward towards other places like another village, Minkovka, and consolidate and take control of territory along the eastern, if you like, the eastern bank of the aqueduct, including, by the way, consolidate control over the area around the village of Orekhovo, Vasilievka. Anyway, if the Russians do that, then because of the way in which the aqueduct loops westwards, that will put them within comfortable artillery distance of both Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, which must be the ultimate objectives of the Russians in the Chasiv Yar operation. And I think this is an intriguing idea, and it might very well be precisely what the Russians do in fact intend to do, that they will push northward from Kalinina through Grigorievka, capturing more of these small scattered villages that lie east of the aqueduct northwards, and place themselves in a position where they can start shelling Kramatorsk and Slavyansk from these positions east of the aqueduct. I don't think that the Russians would do this as an alternative to the capture of Chasiv Yar. But I think by this point in the war, the Russians are strong enough to do both. In other words, they're strong enough to cross the aqueduct and to advance deep into Chasiv Yar, the central and western parts of Chasiv Yar, and we see that they are already doing so. And they also have enough troops to continue their advance northwards to Grigorievka and to these other places, Mercouris and others, and Minkovka and others, all of which will, as I said, put them within artillery range, medium range artillery range of both Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. It makes logical sense, and it is consistent with what we know. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the fighting in Chasiv Yar. As I said, the news that the Russians are in central Chasiv Yar is already very dramatic. The news that they have captured Kalinina, well, it's important. It's not dramatic because the battle for Kalinina has been underway for some time. But the fact that the Russians now not only control the village itself, but all of the outlying buildings located in some cases some distance from the actual village, well, that is of course important and interesting. That the Russians might have further plans to advance north is intriguing as well. But as I said, it's always important to remember that we can speculate about what the Russians are going to do, but only they know for sure. And what we can say for certain is that the Russians are now in central Chasiv Yar. Now, the other place where there's been this breakthrough, which is along the main road from Konstantinovka to Vuhledar, well, that does appear to be a continuing crisis. And we are now getting more reports that the Russians are widening the area that they control along the road and on the road itself. In fact, if I could just go back briefly to the military summary channel, they were suggesting this morning that the Russians might soon be in control of roughly a third of the distance of this road between Konstantinovka and Vuhledar. Now, that is an interesting and important fact in itself. It's also apparently interesting and even ominous for the Ukrainians that it seems that the Ukrainian troops who were tasked with retaining control of this road are apparently unwilling to keep fighting and are retreating from the road, so that the Russians are apparently able to capture large tracts of territory in this area and sections of the road itself without meeting much in the way of resistance. Well, all that is very interesting. But the even more interesting thing, at least for me, is observing what happens if one looks closely at a map. Because though it's clear that there are various roads that go to Vuhledar, it's clear that this road, the road from Konstantinovka to Vuhledar, and by the way, it goes beyond Vuhledar to the town of Pavlovka, which the Russians captured in the winter of 2023, and which is firmly under their control. Anyway, this road is undoubtedly the biggest and most important road in this area, and has therefore served as the main supply road. But the other very interesting thing is that if the Russians cross this road and capture a village called Vodyane and then continue to advance westwards, the distance between Vodyane and the next supply road westwards, which as far as I can see is the only important remaining supply road to Vuhledar, becomes very short. It's no great distance. And Vodyane itself is apparently a very small place made up of low-rise, sort of small cottages, wooden and brick cottages. It could probably be captured by the Russians quite quickly. There are apparently some fortified positions that the Ukrainians have created between these two roads, which are presumably occupied by Ukrainian troops. But I have to say that it does seem to me unlikely that Ukrainian fortifications in this area between these two roads will be particularly complex or heavily engineered. Why would they be? The Ukrainians probably would not have anticipated that there would be a Russian offensive in this area. So these fortifications would have been created more for precautionary purposes than anything else. Anyway, there are fortifications, but if, as I suspect, the fortifications are rather improvised and weak, and if the reports are true, and that the soldiers, the Ukrainian soldiers in this area, are not resisting with much energy or determination, then it may be the case that once the Russians have consolidated their control of the road and the fields around it, and have built up their supplies, that they will indeed cross the road, capture Vuhledar, move on to the next road, capture stretches of that road, in which case Vuhledar would indeed be in effect cut off from effective resupply. Now, it would not be surrounded. It would still be possible for men to go to and to leave Vuhledar across the open fields and the open country, and no doubt there are pathways and dirt tracks and that sort of thing. But maintaining a battle group such as the one in Vuhledar in a battle-ready condition without the use of proper metalled roads, as we have seen many times in this conflict, is impossible for any prolonged period of time. Logically, if what I say does happen, and the Russians do advance beyond the road and capture Vuhledar and then move on to the next road, then the correct thing for the Ukrainians to do, I would have thought, would be to abandon Vuhledar, with all that would mean in psychological and strategic terms. Well, most probably the Ukrainians aren't going to do that. And of course, to repeat again, I don't know what the Russian plans are, but it does seem that they do now control significant stretches of this road, that they do control surrounding fields, that they are enlarging the area of their control, that Ukrainian resistance is weak, and it could be that the Russians do intend to do precisely what I've just said. That might be the strategy that General Gerasimov, the overall Russian military commander, discussed with the command staff of Group of Forces East, the military staff that is running things in this area. And if so, we will no doubt find out within the next couple of days. If what I say is correct, huge if, this isn't my field of expertise, as I've discussed many times. If the Russians do advance beyond the road, if they do capture Vuhledar, if Ukrainian resistance is as weak as I've suggested, and if they do manage to reach the next road, which, as I said, is no great distance, and cut that road as well, all many ifs, of course, but, why not? Let's engage in a little speculation, if you will. Then, as I said, it looks to me as if the situation in Vuhledar will become terminal, and that might happen much sooner than anybody has expected up to now. The battle for Vuhledar might take much less long than has been assumed until now. Anyway, this is clearly an important situation to watch. Lots going on here. One can understand better now why General Gerasimov rushed to the scene. It does look as if the initial raid on the road was an improvised affair, perhaps imagined or conceived or planned and or executed by a relatively junior officer of the Russian army. If so, one must assume that this person is now being showered with commendations and will receive the necessary decorations and all of that. But anyway, it's a very interesting situation, and we will see how things turn out. Let me repeat again, if Vuhledar is captured by the Russians, then this is a major defeat for Ukraine. Vuhledar itself is a small place, relatively small place. It had a population of around 14,000 before the start of the conflict. In territorial terms, it's rather small. It's basically a mining town made up of large high-rise buildings, obviously built during the Soviet era. Anyway, the place itself is relatively small, but it has been the linchpin of Ukrainian defenses in southern Donbass, and its fall will also, in my opinion, render impossible any repetition of the Ukrainian offensives of last summer, in which the Ukrainians tried to advance towards the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, aiming to sever the Russian land bridge. So, an important consequential battle. Anyway, that's news following up on what I discussed yesterday. But a lot of other things are now taking place in other areas. And we've had some important news in the northern Donbass, the opposite end from Vuhledar. And just as it looks as if the Battle of Vuhledar may be happening much more quickly than I, for one, had anticipated. Well, anyway, it looks as if something fairly similar is about to happen in the Siversk area. Yesterday, the Russians released film of their soldiers raising the Russian flag over the village of Ivano-Darivka. Now, this is another small place, hardly very significant in itself. It's worth saying that it is located about 8 kilometers southeast of Siversk itself, but the Russians would have to advance across open country if they were to attack Siversk from this village, and I doubt that this will be the main axis, if you like, or line of attack that the Russians are going to follow if they do advance towards Siversk. The important point about Ivano-Darivka is that its capture, which is again unexpected, the Russians once more have been shown to be well forward of where the various mapping projects and reporters suppose them to be. Well, again, if one looks at a map, Ivano-Darivka is located in a rather important place because it is immediately south of the village of Verkhnokamianska, which the Russians have been sort of sporadically attacking for some time. The Russians have been working to capture this village, Kamyanska, which lies immediately to the west of Siversk. The Russians captured this village. Then one can say that they are now located immediately to the west of Siversk. But this village, Ivano-Darivka, also lies immediately to the west of the village of Vimka on the railway line that goes from the south into Siversk itself. Now, the Russians have been advancing towards Siversk in three directions. From the south, from the village, the south west, from the village of Razdolovka, captured Razdolovka some days ago. There are reports that they moved beyond Razdolovka and have now occupied the next village north of Razdolovka. And there's a direct line of villages all the way from Razdolovka into Siversk itself. So they're advancing along a road, basically, with all these small villages scattered along it towards Siversk. They've been advancing along the railway line, which passes through Vimka. The reason for the incremental progress along this railway line is that the Russians have had to clear all the various fortified positions that the Ukrainians created east and west of the railway line. But with Ivano-Darivka now under their control, they're probably able to capture Vimka fairly quickly, and that will position the Russians further north up the railway line, much closer to Siversk itself. And they have also been advancing from the northeast, from Belogorovka, which they also captured some time ago, and Sportwear. And here the villages of Verkhnom Kamyanska and perhaps Serebyanka further north also become important. Suffice to say that with the capture of Ivano-Darivka, the moment when we are looking at the encirclement of Siversk, the effective encirclement of Siversk, and the start in earnest of the battle for Siversk, that's going to come much more quickly, perhaps, than might have been expected some days ago. Now, again, if Siversk is captured by the Russians, alongside the various successful Russian operations further north, along the Oskol and Zherebets rivers, and the Russians, as we know, now control the village of Makeyevka, at least the part of the village of Makeyevka that lies on the east bank of the Zherebets river. Anyway, the Russians, in strong position, once they've captured Siversk and these other places, to also capture or recapture the town of Liman. And again, that puts them well within artillery range of Slavyansk. So one could see how the Russians gradually are assembling their forces. They're bringing their forces closer together. They look like they're in a position in the Chasov Yar area to bring their forces within artillery range of both Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. They are in the process of capturing Chasov Yar. They're in the process of capturing, if Chasov Yar is captured, they would be in a position to capture other towns around Chasov Yar, immediately to the south of Kramatorsk. And in the north, they are also now edging ever closer towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, with the two towns of Siversk and Liman now both coming within sight of being finally captured. Well, all very interesting. As I said, we will see how it all plays out. Now, there are, of course, other battles going on in other places. There is very great confusion about the state of the fighting in Volchansk. Group of Forces North continues to publish its regular updates, but these have become very impressionistic and they don't give us a precise sense of precisely what is happening. One gets the sense that the Russians are continuing their advances in Volchansk. They now have a significant bridgehead south of the Volcha River. They also have a significant bridgehead further west on the western bank of the Siversk Donetsk river. The Ukrainians have been launching frantic counterattacks in this area, but apparently with no success to speak of. So the battle for Volchansk is steadily tilting in favor of the Russians. At least that's the impression I'm getting. But we don't have much detailed information about it. Presumably, when the Russians achieve their breakthrough, which I suspect they will, then at that point, Group of Forces North would start to describe the situation a great deal more clearly than it has been doing up to this point. Anyway, that's one place, Kharkiv area, fighting still going on there. There continue to be steady Russian advances in the Donetsk area, and this is really very surprising. This is one of the most heavily fortified areas of the entire combat line. One might have expected that the Ukrainians would be able by now to stop the Russian advances, but the Russians are still managing to expand their area of control. Both of the two pincer movements that they've launched into the Donetsk area continue their advance. In New York, Novgorodsky, they continue to gain additional positions, and the same is true further north in an area of a suburb of Donetsk called Druzhba as well, where the Russians maintain their advance. But much more dramatic, perhaps, no more important. The Russians seem to be making faster progress in the Avdiivka Ocheretino area. Firstly, there are now reports that Russian troops have entered the village of Progress, which is located to the north of Yevgenivka, that the Russians captured some time ago, and west of Ocheretino. That the Russians have now actually entered this village, and that fighting is now starting inside the village itself. Progress is important because it is part of the wider Pokrovsk, Mirnograd conurbation area. The Russians capture Progress. As I said, that will soon enough bring them within artillery range of Pokrovsk. And by the way, even closer artillery range of the other big supply town in this area, which is Selidovo. And a little to the west, to the southwest of, to the southwest of Progress, in Novoselivka Persha, pictures have now appeared which show Russian soldiers clearing this village of their Ukrainian defenders. It looks as if Novoselivka Persha has either fallen or is perhaps hours away from doing so. And the Russians also are pushing through the village of Karlovka. They recently captured another village, Yasnobrodovka, in this area. Again, if you go to a map you will see how dangerously close, especially to Selidovo, as I said, a major Ukrainian supply base, all of these various villages are. And once again, we get the news of very disorganized Ukrainian defenses, of Ukrainian soldiers becoming increasingly reluctant to fight with the intensity that perhaps one might have come to expect. The fighting in this area really is a battle for control of these small villages. One after the other, however, they tumble under Russian control. There doesn't seem to be any real sign that the Ukrainians are able to hold the Russians back to any degree. And, well, with the Russians probably soon going to capture Karlovka and Progress, it's likely that the Russians will continue to push west and to push north. There are reports which say that the Russians are literally outside the village of Vozdvizhenka in the north, which lies along the road, the main road that leads from Pokrovsk to Chasiv Yar. Anyway, the Russians likely to attack Vozdvizhenka before long, and if Karlovka falls, the Russians will also be able to advance further along the road, the E50 road, which is a major road from Karlovka to Selidovo, cutting off supply lines potentially to Kurachovo and other positions further south, disrupting Ukrainian communications and transport links, simplifying the Russians' own transport links, and preparing the battle for Pokrovsk, Selidovo, Mirnograd, and all of these other places. So, wherever you look, everywhere along the battlefronts, the situation is very bad. Again, there is still, I find, intense unwillingness to acknowledge this truth in the media in the West or amongst Western commentators. People still talk about incremental Russian advances, a stalemate situation. There was an article by Hamish de Bretton Gordon in the Daily Telegraph in which he said that the Russians have failed to achieve any major breakthroughs. They didn't manage to capture Kharkiv city, which is of course never their objective in Kharkiv region. I think that, putting aside the fact that Putin has said that it was never their objective, when the Russian forces entered Kharkiv region, it was widely acknowledged that they were nowhere near numerous enough to capture Kharkiv itself. But anyway, Hamish de Bretton Gordon comforts himself with the thought that the Russians are only advancing slowly, one village at a time, that they haven't yet captured any of the major cities, that Kharkiv wasn't captured. He takes entirely true Ukrainian and other claims about vast Russian losses. He says that the Russians can't possibly keep going given the scale of the losses that they are suffering. He doesn't, of course, acknowledge Ukrainian losses. So there continues to be denial about this. There's a long article today in The Economist which says that Russia is almost at the end of its tether, that the huge stocks of Soviet-era armored vehicles, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, and all of the other things that the Russian army refurbishes and throws into the battle line, that those stocks are now almost exhausted. I've seen reports like this going back now 2 years. I can remember back in March of 2022, the Daily Telegraph saying that the Russians had almost run through their entire stockpile of cruise missiles. That was in March 2022. But anyway, these articles still appear, and it's still possible just to persuade people in the West, or to lull people in the West into thinking that all of this is true, because the nature of the attrition battle doesn't make clear the threadbare state of the Ukrainian forces and the extent to which they're being pushed back from the fortified positions that they created with such effort over so many years before the special military operation began. But what all of these people, The Economist, Hamish de Bretton Gordon and the rest, really do need to understand is that we're coming increasingly close now to the point where it will no longer be possible to sustain this illusion. The major Ukrainian fortified positions are starting to break down. Not starting, they are breaking down. Ukrainian resistance is eroding. Perhaps we've got 3 or 4 months of heavy fighting still to go in Donbass. But beyond that, with more of these villages taken, the final culminating battle in Donbass for Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and probably for Pokrovsk, will be starting in earnest. And at that point, I suspect it will no longer be possible to deny the crisis that is taking place. Now, I am going to make a guess that some people in the Western militaries, particularly people who are there on the ground, and we know that they are there on the ground, are trying to inform Western governments of all of this. But I very much doubt that what they're saying is getting through. There is, I've discussed in the past, that there is apparently a plan that's been put together to try to create a defense line along the Dnieper River, the so-called Iron Triangle of cities, Zaporozhye, Kryvyi Rog, Nikopol, those sort of places, trying to build a sort of fortified positions along the Dnieper River in order eventually to try to stop the Russian advance westwards. But the source who first informed me of that plan, which is definitely a plan, I've had corroboration from another source that it does indeed exist. Anyway, the source has told me, or rather has communicated to me, the fact that there is still resistance to acknowledging the implication of this plan to create this defense line, which is that it will mean the abandonment and loss of eastern Ukraine, the entirety of Ukraine east of the Dnieper River. And I said that I'd seen corroboration about this from another source, which I have done. And I understand also that one Western government in particular has been told by its military that eastern Ukraine, east of the Dnieper River, is lost, that sooner or later the Russians will control all of it, and that the only viable military strategy is to try to create a defense line along the Dnieper, but that it's far from certain even that defense line in the end can hold. Anyway, I mention all of this, as I said, because there continues to be this attitude of denial, this refusal and inability to face up to the need for negotiations or discussions or for serious thinking about Ukraine. In fact, there's a wonderful article by The Economist, Jack Rasmus, which gives a further example of the kind of magical thinking that is still underway. Jack Rasmus discusses the plan that has now been put together to use the interest from the frozen Russian assets to float a $50 billion loan to keep Ukraine going through, to continue to keep it going beyond the point when the existing appropriations, those made by the United States and others, finally run out. And it's a very fascinating article. It shows the extraordinary debates that have been taking place on this issue between the Americans and the Europeans. But the thing that stood out for me from this article is that Jack Rasmus makes the point that the total cost to the West of keeping Ukraine going amounts to something like $200 billion a year. This is half of it in military aid, half of it in civilian aid. Assuming that all of those $300 billion of Russian assets, frozen Russian assets, were indeed seized, which, well, we all know about the legal problems and the political problems about which some people are still in denial, though Janet Yellen has now come forward and admitted that, well, all that's happening with all the sanctions is indeed making some people question the wisdom of sticking with the dollar. Not that she suggests any change, of course. But anyway, let's assume, and as Rasmus does, that the Western powers somehow overcome all their scruples and all their doubts and actually seize these assets. $300 billion may sound like a huge amount of money, but at present spending rates, it would only buy Ukraine a year and a half of time. And that doesn't even look at what's going on the actual battlefronts. As he basically says, the whole plan, putting aside its economic and legal and political consequences, really doesn't seem to have much point. It's not going to change anything in the end. It's going to bring about, all it can do is delay the point of collapse, and probably not even by the 18 months that it would continue to fund. So anyway, there we are. All of these fantasies and stories still continue to circulate, but some Western governments still cling on and continue along the present course. The new British government, the new British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, he's now been Prime Minister for just over 2 weeks. And yesterday, he took what I thought was one of the most bizarre decisions I've ever heard. he invited Vladimir Zelensky, who is currently in Britain, attending a rather odd conference with European leaders, which Starmer has convened in Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire. Again, it's very unclear to me what this conference is supposed to do. But anyway, Starmer has invited Zelensky to attend a meeting of the British cabinet and to address the cabinet on Ukraine's behalf. What is the purpose of this? Well, on the one hand, it is a flamboyant expression of the new Labour government's continued support for Ukraine. But given that Ukraine is going down, given that Ukraine is losing the war, given that Britain itself has lost the ability, has exhausted its ability to supply Ukraine with more weapons and economic assistance, and given that the political tide, both in Europe and the United States, is shifting against further support for Ukraine, it seems to me an astonishingly weird thing for a British Prime Minister to do. And yet we see that a British Prime Minister does it. But the British political class is still so single-minded in its support of Ukraine that this incredible invitation to a foreign leader to attend a British cabinet meeting has gone by without anybody in Britain showing any real sign of concern. One would have thought that there would be protests, there would be complaints. Some people would point out the lack of wisdom of this, that it might be a better moment now to start thinking about putting some distance between Britain and the obviously failing figure of Vladimir Zelensky. But no, Britain, its Prime Minister, its government must continue to embrace him instead. A case, if you like, of lashing your flag to a sinking ship. I just truly do not understand it. Now, Donald Trump is, of course, going to be speaking to Zelensky. Apparently, they're going to have a call today. Zelensky, I think, has been keen to speak to Donald Trump. Judging from what J.D. Vance and Donald Trump have been saying, I can't imagine that anything Zelensky tells Trump is going to make Trump change his mind. Even as Trump speaks to Zelensky over the phone, he will no doubt be thinking back to another telephone conversation he had with Zelensky, one that happened, well, some years ago, shortly after Zelensky was elected president of Ukraine, a conversation whose contents, in my opinion, were completely misrepresented to the point where they led to an attempt to have Donald Trump impeached. And I can't imagine, given that history, that Donald Trump, who has a long memory for this sort of thing, I can't imagine that that makes him feel very keen to indulge Zelensky in further conversations. But at least there is a point to a conversation between Zelensky and Trump at this time. Zelensky hoping to change Trump's mind, Trump wanting no doubt to impress Zelensky that he cannot rely any longer on being given by the United States more blank checks. But why on earth is the British government acting instead in this eccentric way of having Zelensky address the cabinet? Anyway, other countries, of course, a great deal less impressed. I mentioned yesterday in my program that the Indian government is absolutely furious about the comments Zelensky made about Prime Minister Modi's visit to Moscow and Modi's visit and lengthy summit meeting with Vladimir Putin. Zelensky complained angrily that Modi had in some way let the side down, that it was a tragedy, supposedly, that the leader of the world's largest democracy, which is, of course, India, had associated himself with a bloody war criminal, in other words, Putin. Anyway, the Indians took these comments of Zelensky's very badly. The Ukrainian ambassador was called in to the Indian Foreign Ministry, where he was handed a stiff note and a protest. I cannot imagine that Modi will be very pleased with Zelensky. The two men did not get on at all well on the one occasion when they met, which was at a G7 summit meeting in Tokyo. And this event will have made Modi even less keen on dealing with Zelensky in future. India is, of course, a rising power. It is the self-appointed but widely accepted and acknowledged leader of the global south. Zelensky has shown his extraordinary ineptitude in diplomacy through his pointless alienation of the Prime Minister of India. But no, this doesn't seem to impress or concern the British government. They instead invite him into the cabinet. Well, there we go. Anyway, another government has also been speaking and making its feelings about the general situation clear, and that is China. And this took place over the course of a Security Council debate chaired by Russia, by the way. This Security Council debate looked at the situations in Gaza and in Ukraine, and the Chinese made very clear again their anger at the statements made about them at the latest NATO summit and the fact that they were named by NATO as Russia's decisive enabler in the NATO communique that was published following that NATO summit. And we read that the Chinese ambassador to the United Nations, Fu Zhong, said, against the backdrop of the crisis in Ukraine and the ongoing Palestinian-Israeli conflict, countries are highly concerned about international common security, and many peace-loving countries and peoples are working tirelessly to bring peace. However, NATO, a regional military bloc left over from the Cold War, has been seeking to expand its sphere of influence, stopping at nothing to create false narratives, pouring oil on the fire wherever they go, stirring up confrontation between camps, and even shifting the blame to countries outside the region to frame them on the issue of Ukraine. This is just the opposite of what the international community is doing in promoting peace and negotiations. History has amply proved that wherever NATO's hand extends, turmoil and chaos will ensue. China hereby advises NATO and certain countries to conduct some soul-searching and stop being the troublemakers who jeopardize common security at the extent of others. Well, China, furious, India antagonized, Donald Trump openly skeptical, JD Vance not just skeptical but hostile, the Biden administration, the ally that the Starmer government in London probably relied upon, gradually collapsing, falling apart before our eyes, European opinion shifting, and as we have seen, the battles on the front lines in Ukraine steadily going Russia's way. We've had, by the way, a very interesting article in the London Times, which has discussed a recent report about the Battle of Krynky. This is the battle for that little village on the east bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson region. The Ukrainians occupied part of that village for several weeks and months. At the end of 2023, some people still putting them there through much of 2024. The Ukrainian military are still pretending that they are there even now, though no one else thinks so. Anyway, this report spoke of the Ukrainian military having lost 1,000 men killed in Krynky. Something like 250 are known to be dead. Another 750 or whatever it was apparently have been lost. They've disappeared without trace. Virtually everybody assumes that they're actually dead. Apparently this report has stirred quite a lot of anger in Ukraine, and it turns out, incidentally, that the commander of the Ukrainian forces in Krynky, the man who was responsible for the operation, was none other than General Sodol, the general who has recently been criticized by Marina Bezuglaya and by the Azov Brigade, and whom Zelensky very recently sacked. The general who the Azov Brigade said has killed more Ukrainian soldiers than many Russian generals. Well, there we have another example of how Ukraine is losing the war. A report from Ukraine itself about staggering losses over control of a single village, with the Ukrainian soldiers bitterly complaining that they were sent on a suicide mission. And yet, the denials in London continue. Zelensky embraced, hugged, and brought in to address the British cabinet. One wonders what Churchill and Attlee and Pitt the Younger and all of the others, British Prime Ministers of the past, Lloyd George, what they would have said. I'm not going to try and guess. This is the point where I end today's programme. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You don't forget, please, to check out our shop where you can find all the amazing things that we have there. Magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.